our extremely distinguished guest. He's a professor of sociology at the University of Oregon. He's the author of so many books, I couldn't possibly name them all. But the most recent one, the Isaac Deutscher Memorial Prize, which many of you in Scotland will know was also won previously by Neil Davidson, and awards the best Marxist book of the year analytically. He's also the author of Marx's Ecology and so many other texts. We couldn't really have a better guest in any field, but particularly in the fields of monopoly capitalism and the politics of nature and the metabolism with nature that Marx notoriously described. So I'm absolutely delighted to be joined tonight by Professor John Bellamy Foster. If you could all please give a virtual round of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be at the Havens Center once again. I spoke to the Havens Center back in 1993 at the invitation of Eric Olin Wright. And at the time I was writing on global ecological crisis, and I had just completed writing my book, The Vulnerable Planet, and I was writing about Marxism and ecology. And that was almost 30 years ago. And unfortunately, not much has improved since then. In fact, we're in a far worse situation. The powers that be have not done anything really to address the scale of the crisis that we're facing. Now, the talk at the Havens Center in 1993, March 1993, was called The Global Ecological Regime of Capitalism. And that's how I was thinking about it at the time of The Vulnerable Planet, at the time I wrote The Vulnerable Planet, which was published in 94. And the idea was that capitalism was not just an economic and social regime, it was an ecological regime as well. And we understood that this was based in the nature of capitalist production, that capitalist production had an effect on the environment. We weren't able to, myself and others who were working on it at that time, were not able to articulate this fully in the early 1990s. It took about 6 years before the metabolic rift theory that Marx had developed was uncovered and reestablished as part of our analysis, and allowed us to understand how the ecological crisis was related to the alienation of nature, how the economic and ecological contradictions came together in capitalism. So in memory of that earlier talk, I've entitled this one, The Climate Crisis and Capitalism's Alienated Ecological Regime. Now I want to talk about three things, essentially. I want to divide this talk into three parts. First is talking about the planetary emergency. The second is Marxian ecology and what it has to bring to bear on the subject. And the third one is the ecology of the future, because we have to look forward from the present point. How do we create a more sustainable environment for humanity? So in terms of the planetary emergency, we often talk about it as though it's simply climate change, and that's understandable because climate change is such a serious and accelerating problem. It certainly has to be dealt with instantly, right away, immediately. There's no alternative to that, but it's part of a larger planetary ecological emergency. And we can understand that best as science does in terms of the planetary boundaries. Basically, we're now in the Anthropocene epoch of the geological timescale. And the Anthropocene is defined by the fact that human beings are now the major factor in Earth system change, in alterations in the entire Earth system. This is a geological first, and officially we're still in the Holocene age. I mean, in the Holocene epoch, and the Holocene goes back 11,700 years, and it has been the period in which human civilization developed, and it's been a fairly benign climate and environment. But science has essentially concluded at this point, although it's not official, that the Holocene has been replaced by the Anthropocene epoch, which started around 1945 or the early 1950s. The usual markers are the detonation of the atomic bomb, the detonation of the first nuclear detonation in 1945, followed by the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki later that year, and then the H-bomb tests in the early 1950s. And this is our major marker for the beginning of the Anthropocene because of the radionuclides that were left behind. There are other markers like plastics, but the Anthropocene begins around 1945, early 1950s, the same time as the global environmental movement begins, and not coincidentally. So we're in this period of the Anthropocene, and it starts off as an anthropogenic rift in the environment, in the Earth system, as science says. Basically, it's a rift, an anthropogenic rift in the biogeochemical cycles of the planet as a result of the expansion of the capitalist economy, economic growth, and so on. So this is what defines the planetary emergency in many ways, but we have to understand it in terms of planetary boundaries. Now, there are 9 planetary boundaries that have been defined by science, and they're essentially defined in terms of what constitutes a safe place for humanity, a safe home for humanity on the planet. And they're defined in terms of the Holocene as the background. And we are crossing or almost all of these planetary boundaries and have crossed some of them. So climate change is one such planetary boundary, but so is ocean acidification, depletion of the ozone layer, the species extinction. We talk about the sixth extinction, but it's also, we have to look at it in terms of the loss of biodiversity in general, the disruption of the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, the loss of ground cover, particularly forests, the loss of fresh water, desertification, the chemical pollution, radioactive pollution, and these planetary boundaries that we're crossing all constitute threats to humanity on a global scale. They're all individually planetary emergencies, and they all have one common denominator, and that's the capitalist world economy. So even if we were to find ways to address climate change, we have to. We also have all of these other planetary emergencies to consider. Ocean acidification has been associated with the great die downs in planetary history. So we need to deal with all of these problems at once. And it's important to understand then that climate change is only part of the problem. Now, if we look at climate change itself, though, we're in a very serious position. And that's laid out in the sixth assessment report of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The sixth assessment report, the physical science basis, was published in early August. And it's the most up-to-date, most sophisticated analysis of the problem, and with the backing of world science, the world scientific consensus. But even I think it was a couple of days before the part one of AR6, the sixth assessment, was published, there was a leak, and other parts of, there were leaks, and part of part three was leaked a couple of days before that. Part three of the sixth assessment wasn't supposed to be published till March. And also we had a leak of part two of the sixth assessment, which wasn't supposed to be published until February. Now, the leaks are very important. The reason that the leaks are occurring is that we're in such a serious place with COP26 approaching, that scientists within the IPCC, in the case of the part three leaks, it was a science rebellion attached to Extinction Rebellion that carried out the leaks. But the leaks are occurring because matters have become so serious that the scientists are trying to get the information out to us while we still have time to act. And they're also occurring because if you know the IPCC process, what happens is that the scientists approve the assessment. The scientists approve the sixth assessment, for example, which they've done. They've approved all the parts of it. But then in the process, the governments and the government representatives are able to come in and redact the report, that is, censor it, so that we don't get what the scientists are telling us. We don't get what is coming out of the process. We get something that is redacted and censored by governments. And so in leaking the reports, they were trying to get out to us what the scientists have actually approved and understand to be the problem before the governments are able to censor it. So this is very important. And so what does the sixth assessment tell us? Well, the important thing, I mean, in part one tells us a great deal. And part one was published on August 9th. It tells us that, as the UN General Secretary said, it's code red for humanity. But he was also thinking of the what the leaked reports reveal as well. The important thing is the shared socioeconomic pathways. That tells us, according to the IPCC, what they think is possible, their scenarios of what is possible. And there are 5 scenarios, 5 socioeconomic pathways that are dealt with in the report. And the first one is optimistic, of course, and it's the best that we can hope for, according to the science. And it's called SSP 1.9. It's the most optimistic of the 5 scenarios, and it's the only one where we will, at the end of the century, according to the scenario, be below 1.5 degrees increase in global average temperature. And what it says is that to conform to the SSP1, this 1.9, the optimistic scenario, the carbon dioxide emissions have to peak worldwide within 4 years. We have to hold off reaching 1.5 degrees Celsius increase until 2040. This is very important. We no longer can stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius for the entire century. I'll explain that. But we have to avoid reaching that marker before 2040. And we have to have net zero carbon emissions in 2050. In these conditions all have to apply for us to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Well, we won't be able to stay below it, but what will happen is that in this scenario is that we will stay below we won't reach 1.5 degrees increase in global average temperature before 2040. Then we will rise, the temperature will rise to an increase of 1.6. And then by the end of the 21st century or the beginning of the 22nd century, we will be able to get the global average temperature down to 1.4 degrees again. This is actually what science thinks is necessary. We used to think that 2 degrees was the point of no return, the point of irreversibility, which is what the scientists worry about, because at a certain point, things will get out of hand with runaway global warming, and we won't be able to stop it or the consequences. And our best chance for achieving that is to stay below 1.5 degrees. Staying below 2 degrees is the backstop, which is probably what they will orient everything to in COP26. But staying below 2 degrees is very, very, that goal puts us in a very dangerous situation, a 50-50 situation of running into extremely dangerous, uncontrollable climate change. So the science really says we have to stay below 1.5 degrees. The final guardrail is staying below 2 degrees. After that, there are 3 more scenarios, and all of them are that are considered, and socioeconomic pathways, and they all are apocalyptic to various degrees. That's not meant as a pun. And the final, the 5th scenario is which we're really headed towards that. The 5th scenario, SSP 8.5, is the absolute cataclysm. It's very apocalyptic, because the best estimate of global average temperature at the end of this century, when many of people alive today will still presumably be alive, the best estimate is that global average temperature will be at 4.4 degrees increase over pre-industrial levels, and perhaps higher than that, but the best estimate is 4.4. But the science tells us that we cannot maintain industrial civilization if we reach a 4-degree increase in global average temperature, industrial civilization will crumble. And if industrial civilization crumbles, so will our state structures, so will it will be absolute disaster for humanity. There really aren't words to describe it. Catastrophe is not sufficient. So this is the situation we're faced with. Now, what's interesting about the leaked climate reports, the leaked part 2 and part 3 of the 6th assessment, the AR6, is that they tell us a lot that lies behind this. The second report is on impacts, and the third report is on mitigation. Now, we actually need to know about mitigation. We have to know what we can do about this, what the scientists are saying we can do about it. But to have access to that, you have to read the leaked report, not the published report, because that tells what the state we're in. And but in the part 2 report, it's very interesting. They have some of this has been provided by the French news service as quoted from the leaked part 2 report, which they have access to. We don't have that whole leaked report publicly, but they wrote apparently the part 2 report says life on Earth can recover from a dramatic climate shift by evolving into new species and creating new ecosystems. Humans cannot. What they were talking about the mass extinctions in history, and they're talking about the 6th extinction and the fact that it may encompass humanity itself. And they're saying, look, we can't destroy life on the planet completely. We can maybe kill off most of the species, but we can kill ourselves off and most of the species, but life will come back. Ecosystems will come back. It's just that the human species won't come back. Evolution won't do that. I think this is quite remarkable coming from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It shows you how serious they think the issue is. But we have a lot from the part 3 report, because both the summary for policymakers of the part 3 report and the chapter 1 of the part 3 report, which deals with mitigation, were leaked. And you can find them on the monthly review website. I can give you more details on that later. But these leaked reports represent on mitigation. The part 3 represents a fundamental shift in terms of the view of the IPCC. They say that we can't. We're not going to be able to make it, particularly with the scenario 1, but even with the scenario 2, with 2 degrees as the guardrail, unless we make fundamental structural change in our socioeconomic system, unless we carry out transformative change. They're basically saying that we have to carry out something equivalent to an ecological revolution. And their emphasis shifted. Previously, of the mitigation strategies were oriented towards the mitigation strategies were oriented towards the supply side, to technology, trying to find technological solutions, because of course they don't want to, the establishment doesn't want to alter capitalist social relations. They want to preserve the system exactly as it is. And so they're trying for years, they've emphasized, well, we can solve this with simply technology and with a little bit of help with from the market. The IPCC report, the sixth assessment, part 3, the leak report, basically says this is not possible. Technology can't get us there. Right now, solar and wind power account for 7% of all energy use. We're not going to substitute for fossil fuels fast enough by the pure technological route. The various technologically intensive methods of direct air capture and BECCS, bioenergy and carbon capture and sequestration, don't exist at scale. They are not, the technologies are not really there, and they have massive consequences to the ecological system if imposed, and these things can't be done fast enough. Nuclear power, the IPCC report says, shouldn't be pursued, and couldn't solve the problem either. So they've shifted towards what they call a demand side strategy that some particularly in the degrowth circles have promoted, eco-socialists have promoted. And where it's been shown that with a demand side strategy, we can reduce energy use by 40% while improving human conditions. And the IPCC mitigation report is basically saying this is the way we have to go. They're drawing on figures from eco-socialist circles, referencing figures like Jason Hickel and Andreas Malm and Andrew Jorgensen and so on, people coming from the eco-socialist analysis that we've been developing. And they say that in the IPCC report, in the leaked report, that many analysts now believe that capitalism is unsustainable altogether. And they clearly point in that direction, that they support the view that capitalism is unsustainable from the standpoint of the climate and protecting humanity. And so we have to change the social relations. And in the Part 3 report, they say that they argue that we have to we can't start any, if we want to conform to the optimistic target, the 1.5 degree target, we can't open any more coal mines, and we have to close all coal-fired plants. We can't open any more coal-fired plants, and we have to close all of the remaining coal-fired plants within a decade across the planet. They argue that we have to create more sustainable cities, that we have to get rid of SUVs and gas guzzling vehicles. They talk about what this can be replaced with, of course, mass transportation and lower energy use vehicles. And they argue for a just transition on the standpoint for labor, but also for what we would say is the working class, but also focusing on vulnerable populations. They support climate strikes. They support the climate strikes that have taken place. They support the broad coalitions that are being built on the ground. So this is a very different kind of IPCC report that really fundamentally, and I wish I had more time to talk about it, conforms to what we have been saying, and within eco-socialist circles. This is just objectively necessary now that we adopt a demand side strategy that questions what we produce and what we consume. And it's very clear that in this analysis that it's not about consumers, it's about production corporations. They point out that something like 46% of all GDP, I think, related to trade from the less developed countries should be counted as carbon emissions in the global north, where the consumption is taking place. So this is a very radical analysis, but science has taken us there. That's where we objectively are. That's how we have to build our movement. Now, I want to say some things about Marxian ecology briefly, and in this context, and the point isn't just to understand this. Obviously, as Marx said, the point isn't just to understand the world. The point is to change it. But now we could add, the point is to change it before it is too late. We are objectively in what we would call a revolutionary situation, and we have to change it before it's too late. And I have a thesis that the way we define a revolutionary situation, and I'll hopefully talk about this later, is a revolutionary situation occurs when the struggle for freedom and the struggle for necessity coincide. There's always been a struggle for freedom, for liberation in class societies over thousands of years of human civilization. The struggle for freedom, of course, it goes in cycles to some extent, but it's always there, as most of you know. And there's also times when the struggle for necessity or a struggle for survival, when conditions impose on human beings to such an extent that survival is the issue. For example, Marx, writing about the situation in Ireland in the post-famine years, said it was a question of ruin or revolution because of the destruction of the ecology, the destruction of the agriculture, and the effects on the Irish peasantry, that it was a question of ruin or revolution. But a revolutionary situation occurs when the struggle for freedom and the struggle for necessity coincide, and I think we're seeing that now. At any rate, if we look at capitalism, what we have to understand is that capitalist production is an economic class system. It involves the exploitation of labor through production, with all the socioeconomic consequences we know, but it's also an ecological system. It's at this production also is a transformation of our relation to the earth. And this is occurring at the same time. And we appropriate from nature, or from the universal metabolism of nature, as Marx called it, in order to produce. And this is the other side of production. And we can have a destructive relation to human society on the economic side, but we can also have a destructive relation to the earth on the ecological side, and capitalism promotes both, a sort of two-sided alienation. Marx introduced three concepts that I think can be seen as his dialectic of the metabolic rift. He introduced, as I said, the universal metabolism of nature. He introduced this notion. He didn't talk just about nature as something apart from society, nature was a universal metabolism, the way we understand it in science today, all the way up to Earth system science. He also introduced a concept called the social metabolism. Marx said that the labor and production process, and he was writing specifically about capitalism, but this applies trans-historically. The labor and production process is a social metabolism with nature. That's we transform nature, we metabolize with nature through production, through our productive activities primarily, in the broad sense. And but when the social metabolism of a particular mode of production, such as capitalism in particular, comes into conflict with the universal metabolism of nature, with the physical law, natural physical laws of nature itself, the requirements of a sustainable environment. When the social metabolism comes into conflict with that and becomes an alienated social metabolism, Marx talked about the alienated mediation. We can talk about the alienated mediation with the earth through production. Then you have the creation of a metabolic rift, an ecological crisis, and which Marx explained first of all in terms of the soil crisis in the 19th century, when the food and fiber that was being shipped hundreds and thousands of miles to the new urban centers where the industrial proletariat was located, this food and fiber was carrying the nutrients, the soil nutrients within it, and the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and other soil nutrients. And this ended up polluting the cities rather than going back to the soil and replenishing the soil. And that kind of break he called an irreparable rift in the interdependent process of social metabolism between nature and society, metabolic rift. And he understood this as a form of ecological crisis and pursued studies in that. And in recent years, we've recovered that notion of the metabolic rift, and we've used that method and expanded it to understand the ecological crisis in general. This isn't any kind of an accident. Marx was the first to introduce the notion of social metabolism and integrate that with an ecological analysis. But all of our systems ecology was, all of it has been based on the metabolism concept. And some of it was influenced by Marx himself. He let's say through his close friend and E. Ray Lankester, who was Darwin and Huxley's protege, but also Marx's close friend, and became the leading ecological critic in England in the generation after Darwin and Huxley. In fact, the leading British biologist at that time. And then this carried forward to Arthur Tansley's notion of the ecosystem. Both Lancaster and Tansley were Fabian-style socialists. Tansley utilized Hyman Levy, the Marxist mathematician's systems theory concepts to develop ecosystem. But metabolism has ended up, was the basis, became the basis of ecosystem analysis, and then later Earth system analysis, biosphere analysis, Earth system analysis. This is how we understand it. And Marx was already formulating it in this way. But the power of Marx's analysis was the concepts of social metabolism and metabolic rift, where he understood the ecological contradictions of capitalism as the other side of its economic contradictions. He understood how these were interrelated with each other. So it's only the analysis that's founded on this basis that provides us with a complete analysis of the ecological crisis, which is both biophysical and social, that and historically specific, and understands it in relation to the exploitation of workers and the expropriation of land and bodies and social reproductive labor. All of these things are integrated in the method that Marx introduced and that has been developed. So this takes us to notion that I've promoted, is the environmental proletariat. How are we going to deal with this? And I've presented a notion of environmental proletariat, which sometimes seems utopian to people, but it really isn't. If you look at Engels's Condition of the Working Class written in 1844 and 45, he was, if you look at what Engels was writing about, he was writing about epidemiological crisis. He's writing about disease and health and deterioration of people's health, basically how the working class was being hit hardest by disease due to the structure of capitalist class society. And Marx later said that this too was part of the metabolic rift analysis, and that the periodic spread of epidemics was part of, it could be compared to the shipment of guano from Peru to the United States, which is the way he was referring to the metabolic rift, that they were similar problems. But in Engels's Condition of the Working Class, he's talking about a period just after the Pol Pot riots, or as the bourgeoisie called them, and but the revolt that it was occurring in that time and associated with Chartism. And he was seeing a revolutionary situation that occurred because people were struggling for their lives and their communities and their housing and their food and their water. At the same time, they were fighting factory labor, and they understood that these things were related, connected. And that's a materialist approach. And we're seeing this everywhere now. It's understood, especially in the global South, that facing the kinds of horrible material conditions that we are, and they are especially, that when you lack water, you lack food, when there's a spread of disease and so on, that these things, these material problems, these problems of housing and water and food and so on, are not separate from the problem of exploitation in work, that expropriation of our resources and our lives, and enslavement in various ways, various kinds of expropriation are tied to exploitation. So there's, and ecological and economic crises now are so interrelated that we have to see them together. And this gives rise to an environmental proletariat that's struggling not just for freedom, but for necessity. That's where the most revolutionary movements emerge. So I think this is a crucial way of understanding our time. We have to fight for a society that has ecological sustainability, substantive equality, and sustainable human development. Those are actually all historical materialist principles. I have my clock, I have about 4 minutes left, so I'm going to add something more about the Anthropocene. And there's criticisms of the notion of the Anthropocene introduced by science. I mean, the Anthropocene concept is introduced by science. And some people on the left have criticized it and saying, well, we should call it the Capitalocene. But that's really a category error. It's a major mistake because it doesn't understand the critical nature of the Anthropocene as it's been introduced to science. And there's one way of looking at the Anthropocene is in terms of how it appeared. It appeared in the context of an ecological crisis, what scientists have called an anthropogenic rift in the biogeochemical cycles of the planet, which is actually the way Marx theorized things in terms of metabolic rift. It's now an anthropogenic rift in the Earth system on a global scale. But the Anthropocene is not actually defined by that. That's how we're experiencing it. What defines the Anthropocene in science, what actually defines it, is the fact that for the first time in all planetary history, human beings, humanity, anthropogenic factors are the major force in change in the entire Earth system. It's not that, I mean, we've affected the environment from when humanity first rose, of course, emerged, but we're now human beings, the anthropogenic factors, are the main force in altering the entire Earth system, in Earth system change. And that's not going to stop. Now, if we follow down the path that we are now in the Anthropocene under capitalism, headed towards the IPCC's fifth scenario that takes us to 4.4 degrees increase in global average temperature, what we're talking about then is an Anthropocene extinction event in the terms of science. The Anthropocene will end in an extinction event which will take humanity with it. That's the only way, the Anthropocene will actually be here. It will continue to exist as long as industrial civilization exists and persists, right? Assuming there is no Anthropocene extinction event, as long as industrial civilization exists, human beings will continue to be on this kind of razor's edge, where we will be the main factor affecting the Earth system change. We can have a more co-evolutionary, sustainable relation to the Earth system, to the planet, and so on. But there's no way that we are not going to remain the major factor in Earth system change as long as humanity exists from now on. So then how do we deal with that problem? I mean, the Capitalocene just sort of doesn't confront that at all. It just sort of says, well, we'll call it the Capitalocene. Well, what comes after the Capitalocene? I mean, it doesn't, and it misses that critical element that that we're in a totally different position and will be as long as industrial civilization survives. The way to understand it, I think, is that we're still officially in the Holocene epoch, and every epoch is divided into ages, usually 3 ages. And right now we live in the Meghelian age of the Holocene. Officially, we're in the Meghelian age, which goes back 4,200 years. And it was thought by scientists to coincide with some of the earliest crises of human civilization 4,200 years ago, associated with climate change. And at that time, there's debate about this in science now, especially coming from archaeologists, but that the Meghelian was designated in that way. It goes back 4,200 years. But if we're in the Anthropocene now, the Anthropocene has to have a first age. What is the first age of the Anthropocene? And the causes of that first age would be the same as the causes of the Anthropocene. Well, the first age of the Anthropocene, Brett Clark and I, who are professional environmental sociologists, decided to name the Capitalinean. The first age of the anthropocene we say is the Capitalidian, and we have an article. We had an article in the September, I guess the September 2021 month review called the Capitalidian, where we describe the Capitalidian, which is our age of planetary environmental crisis, and we argued that it's based on it's a geological age rooted in capitalism and capitalism's period of destruction of the earth, the point at which capitalism has become a danger to the entire earth system. The age of the Capitalidian starting in 1945 or in the early 1950s. But we argue that by 2050, we have to shift to a new age of a new geological age of the earth called the communion, after community, communal, commune. And we have to create a sustainable relation to the planet, a period of sustainable human development, of ecological sustainability and substantive equality, but this can only occur by way of an ecological revolution based on the environmental proletariat, conceived in the very broadest sense. I think that this is the nature of the problem that we face. Marx talked about the chain of human generations. We're facing the breaking of the chain of human generations and the destruction of the lives of the youth on the planet today, if not all of us, and certainly the destruction of the future. Jean-Paul Sartre once said, a barred future is still a future. But what he really meant was we can do the impossible. Thank you.
A wonderful note to end on there. Thank you so much, John. I'm sure everyone really appreciated that. And I'm sure it's inspired a lot of people to want to ask some questions. What I'm going to do, if John doesn't mind, I'm going to take people in threes. If you could raise your hand virtually, as it's very difficult for me to navigate 150 or whatever people at once otherwise. I have Michael and Pablo, just to say I will be operating a progressive stack. So if there's women wanting to speak, I will take them as well. But firstly, I'll take Michael.
Thank you very much, James, and thank you so much, John, for that brilliant lecture. I have a very quick question. Since the IPCC report, has there been a notable increase in activity from the climate change denial/delayist lobby? And if so, how can we counteract that lobby's influence? Thank you.
Thank you for Michael for an admirably brief question as well, which I like. We're going to take Pablo, and then if others would like to speak, please do raise your hand. Can I remind you, if you do want to speak, if you could possibly put your camera on, that would be ideal as well. Thank you, Pablo. I can't hear you, sorry. I don't know if others can. Can others hear?
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Well, that's better. Yes, I can hear you now.
Sorry about that. I was saying that I am based in Guatemala City, where I work for the public university, and I also spent some time in Scotland, as a matter of fact. So I'm really happy to, listen to what's going on in Scotland these days. So thank you so much for this brilliant presentation, John. I've been a fan for some years now, and I just wanted to ask you about this difference that you made between Capitalism and Capitalian in terms of epochs and ages. To what extent this actually captures the fact that I mean, for those in the global south, we definitely have a differentiated responsibility in terms of what's actually going on with this ecological crisis. So I was wondering how we can actually include that in this notion of anthropocene without being unfair, to most of us who, frankly speaking, have very little to do with the root causes for things like global for climatic change and those things. So that's what I was wondering. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thank you. I'm going to bring in Rosalind.
Oh, hi. Let me just bring up my question on my screen because I'm a bit drunk. So, so it seems that part of resetting our social relations around nature requires a new way of valuing nature, to how capitalism currently does or perhaps fails to. So can you talk about what contemporary Marxist theory, sorry, my dog is whining. Can you please talk about what contemporary Marxist theory has to say on nature and valuation, and especially on alternatives to monetary forms of valuation?
Three excellent questions there, and thank you also for the intervention from the dog. John, I'm going to bring you back in.
All right, I'm going to try to give quick answers to questions that could take days. But in terms of the first question, has the IPCC report resulted in new contentions by denialists? I think there is some, but we have to understand that the outright climate denialists, those who say there is no problem, that the Trumpists, for example, in the United States, that climate change doesn't exist, they are supplemented by, and maybe even outnumbered by, the liberal denialists who basically say, yeah, there is climate change, but the market and technology will take care of it, and that we don't need to do anything to change social relations, that capitalism is the solution. There's one, I was looking at the Breakthrough Institute the other day. They're a liberal eco-modernist organization, or the prime think tank for liberal eco-modernism, and capitalism can solve all ecological problems through technology and so on. And I noticed that their director of energy had an article published 2 days after the IPCC report, after the physical science basis one was published, and he said that carbon emissions were flattening, and that the more serious scenarios were not so serious after all. But he did this mostly he referred to AR5 from 6 years before, rather than referring to AR6, which had just been published 2 days before his thing was published. And I think that it was all designed to take the attention off of how serious it is by this notion that, oh, it's the carbon emissions are flattening, we don't need to worry. And this is a guy who actually in his other hat, I forget his name right now, but he writes for Carbon Brief and says more sensible things there. But from the Breakthrough Institute, he put out this thing that the problem is going away. Capitalism is flattening the carbon emissions, so not to worry. All of this is completely bogus in terms of the science. And in terms of Capitalocene, Capitalian, and Anthropocene, and the global South, I think the important thing from the standpoint of the global South is how imperialism is brought into this. So I wrote an article with my colleagues, Hannah Holman and Brett Clark, for a monthly review, I don't know, maybe a year ago, called Imperialism in the Anthropocene, explaining how the global South was being particularly affected. And what was unique about this article was that we don't usually talk about the geographical or geophysical aspects, but the science tells us that the low latitude countries are much more affected by climate change. And we have to start taking this in consideration in our analysis, as as the mainstream does. We have to understand that there are certain countries, regions of the world, which for no fault of their own, are really on the front line with respect to climate change, particularly in the low latitude regions and islands. So, and it's mostly the global south, of course, since it's low latitude. And we have to understand that this is further complicated by imperialism, that imperialism always hits is directed at the global south, and just as there's economic imperialism, there's ecological imperialism. And we also need to recognize, and this article explained, that ecological imperialism is actually being planned in the context of the climate crisis. So we explored the military and political strategies, imperial strategies, that are being introduced in the United States to take advantage of the climate crisis and the ecological devastation of the global south in order to expropriate more resources, more control, expand imperialism, and so on. And we did this based on government reports and what the Pentagon was saying. So we have to be really understand this. We have to understand that actually, if we're going to combat climate change and this whole problem, it's where the struggle for freedom and the struggle for necessity most coincide, that we're going to see, that's going to be the front line of the conflict, and it's in the global south. We all are involved, and there'll be struggles all over the world, but the global south, for all of these reasons, is really the critical point of change. It's the critical point of revolution in our day, as well as in the 20th century. So there are ways in which the issues fall quite differently on different hemispheres. In terms of new ways of valuing nature, I did a book recently with Brett Clark called The Robbery of Nature that deals with this, that when Marx was talking about the metabolic rift, he also talked about the robbery of nature, that is, or the expropriation of nature. The expropriation, he talked about the expropriation of nature, he talked about the expropriation of human bodies. Slavery is the greatest example of that. And we have to, but we have to understand that nature is basically being robbed or expropriated in the sense that we're not following processes of reciprocity or sustainability. We're not maintaining the earth. And we have to have a conception of community with the earth. We have to enlarge our notion of community to relate to the earth as a whole. And Marx actually developed the most radical conception of sustainability ever developed, where he said, we don't own the earth. Nobody owns the earth. Not all the people in the world own the earth. We only hold it basically in trust for the chain of human generations. He defined it precisely how we define sustainability, but in a far more radical way. And that's the way we have to think. It's not questioning an abstract concept of value. Most of our concepts of value are taken from the commodity economy. And certainly we have to have an intrinsic value, sense of intrinsic value of nature. But really that comes down to having a community of nature, a sense of sustainability and reciprocity, and not in terms of an abstract concept of value derived from a monetary or commodity economy.
Thanks, John. Could I take any more questions? We have some people. Please do feel free to put things in the chat, and I am happy to read them out. We have, is it Vren and Vicky? Apologies if I pronounce your name wrong, and that goes for all, of course. But I'll take Vren first.
Thank you. Let me just put my... Okay, thank you. My question is actually just a repeat of a question that I heard earlier. And that is, I want to come back to the problem of the Capitalocene and the Anthropocene, because I wanted to understand the stakes in that debate. Because if I understand what you said correctly, it seemed like the periodization for what some people are calling the Capitalocene and what you're calling the Anthropocene is very similar. That both the Anthropocene and the Capitalocene, which if we understand the Anthropocene, as you were saying, is when the human beings begin to make more of an impact and so on, that seems to be the same as the Capitalocene when capitalism emerges, right? And so that in both cases, it seems like the object of critique is capitalism, that we're not going to be able to solve the environmental issue unless we overcome capitalism. So I was wondering what the theoretical stakes are in making this distinction. If you could sort of outline that a little more. I mean, maybe this is too large of a question, but I was wondering, just to pick up on what you were saying already. Is my question clear?
Brilliant. Okay,
yes.
Thank you. We will let John come in on that in a second, but firstly, if I could take Vicky, please.
Thanks. As time is very short, and I think most of us here are persuaded that, well, we need to get rid of capitalism. And John raised the issue of, our hopes are in the environmental proletariat, and I think that's right. But it seems like the environmental proletariat is quite a long way away from where it needs to be, sort of ideologically. So I just wondered, I think we can work on different small projects to get it closer. For example, the R&T Union has just had its conference, and there was an ideological battle there, and they managed to persuade them to take a more environmental stance than in previous years. But I just wondered if John had any thoughts on how we can get the insights and the theory and the ideas that you're talking about into working class organizations. Thanks.
Brilliant question. I've got time for one more question, if anyone would like. I think this will be our last round, given the time, and we want to let people go at 7:30. So would anyone like to ask a last question? Okay. Oh, yep. Okay, brilliant. We have the Sane Collective.
Hi there, it's Mark Langdon here. The Sane Collective is solidarity against neoliberal extremism, so I think I'm amongst friends. Just on that kind of point about getting these issues into the working class consciousness, I'm interested in John's thoughts about the appropriation of the education system. The mainstream education, not just higher education, but I'm talking about, right through primary and secondary, not just in countries like Scotland, but across Africa, and the way that education has been neoliberalized. And if you take a country like Scotland, where you've still got a highly unionized workforce, but still very complicit in reproducing the same kind of capitalist vision of future. So I'm just interested if John has, because I know that there's a lot of activism in the States around these kind of issues as well. So I'm interested in how that, his thoughts on how that might play out.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And finally, John, before I ask you to come back on these excellent questions, there's another question in the chat regarding the nature of China. its carbon emissions, its contribution, and also perhaps its relationship to debates about capitalism and socialism. So perhaps you'd like to have some thoughts on that conversation in the chat as well. But I'll let you come back in if that's okay with you.
All right. In terms of the Capitalocene and Anthropocene, the periodization is not the same. The capitalism, we all agree, came into existence in the middle of the 15th century. This is what Marx argued. This is what world systems theory argued. And it went through various stages like mercantilism and competitive capitalism, monopoly capitalism, and so on. But capitalism came into existence in the 15th century. The Anthropocene, according to science, comes into existence at the end of the Second World War, basically with the first nuclear detonation and with the spread of radionuclides, with the H-bomb tests and the plastics and so on. And you see the great acceleration at that time. So there's a qualitative change in the human relation to the Earth system. It's a threshold effect, what Engels called a quantitative change leading to a qualitative transformation. They're arguing that that occurred in the late 1940s, early 1950s, and that's when the Anthropocene comes into effect. And the Anthropocene has to do with human beings being a force of change of the entire Earth system. To understand this, you have to have a concept of the Earth system, which I can't explain to you now, but it's not just the environment. It's not just affecting the environment. It's affecting the entire Earth system, which is bigger than the biosphere, of course. And this is what defines the Anthropocene, the human beings becoming the force in the change of the Earth system. So the Capitalocene is, nobody agrees. I mean, the Capitalocene was a kind of one-off. Andreas Malm first introduced it, and it was just a notion. Oh, let's call it the Capitalocene rather than the Anthropocene, because it's really capitalism that's causing this, which made a certain amount of sense. But the problem is that even if we get beyond capitalism, we're still in this fundamental situation that defines the Anthropocene according to science, and that is that we are going to remain the major force in Earth system change, even in a socialist society. And so we have to have an understanding of that. What we really have to do is, we want to stay in the Anthropocene, because if we stop, the only way we would stop being a major force in affecting the Earth system is if we destroyed industrial civilization and ourselves. So it's a question in the scientific understanding of this, developed by geologists and physical scientists generally, that we need to find a way to survive within the Anthropocene in that context. So it makes sense to go to the level of ages and understand that we're in the Capitolinian age, which is an age of an anthropogenic rift, an actual anthropogenic rift in the Anthropocene, and try to find our way, get to another phase by around 2050, a great climateric ecological revolution, which will create a different geological relation to the Earth, which we're calling the communion, based on a socialist society rooted in sustainable human development, ecological sustainability, substantive equality, that kind of society. So what we need is an analysis that's in line with the science, but also builds on the critical bases of Marxian theory to take us forward and to organize our struggles. And so that's what that's all about. the capitalist concept doesn't really help in that respect. In terms of the environmental proletariat and how to get the ideas to the working class, might be, one thing. I'm glad that that question was asked by Vicky, I think, because one thing I skipped in my talk was any mention of the IPCC report, the physical science basis report that was published, emphasizes that we are now in the 21st century going to see all sorts of compound events like heavy precipitation, floods, the hurricanes, we're going to see desertification, loss of fresh water, the droughts, the breakdown of monsoons. All of these extreme weather events are developing and are compounding. We're going to experience them in compound form. And this is going to happen. This is already beginning to happen. And this is the future in the next few decades. This is the future in the 21st century, even in the most optimistic scenario. We're facing extreme threats to hundreds of millions, billions of people, even in the most optimistic scenario now. And we can't turn sea level rise around. It will continue to rise even under the best circumstances throughout this century and maybe for a millennium, depending on what we do. So we have to understand that people are going to be facing much more extreme conditions, whatever we, even if we do, even if we get to net zero by 2050, even if we do all these things. And this is going to wake people up. The 20, Marx said 20 years can occur in a day. Now, revolution is all about the acceleration of history. There is going to be massive change occurring. Nothing is stable at this point. And we have to intervene in this. We have to intervene in a way that protects people. Eco-socialists have to be involved in protecting people at the same time that we struggle to protect the planet as a home for humanity. And in this context, I think, in this context, in this ground level context, we will be able to get through. I mean, the working class, not get through the working class, but the working class itself will appreciate the issue. In the United States, the population that is most concerned about climate change in all the surveys is the Black population. Why? Why are they most concerned about climate change in the whole US population? It's not because they are more endangered. Well, they are more endangered, they're more vulnerable in some ways to climate change, but the real factor is that they experience environmental injustice in their everyday lives, which gives them this material insight into the whole problem that the white population lacks. And of course, and also they have less vested interest in the system. So Engels, in his Condition of the Working Class, said when he was describing what was going on, he called it social murder. If we want to get through to the working class, we have to talk about the social murder that's going on. I mean, some of the leading medical journals in the world have taken up Engels's concept of social murder in recent years, but the left hasn't, the socialists haven't. Let's talk about social murder, talk about why this is happening, and happening principally to the most vulnerable, of course. In terms of the third question on working class consciousness and the appropriation of education, yeah, we have to struggle over education. I don't know, I mean, it's a question of struggle. We have to fight very severely for education. The reason education became more progressive everywhere in the 70s and 80s was because of the struggles in the 60s and the 70s that carried it all the way through the schools and into the universities. And eventually that subsided quicker than we thought. With Thatcher and Reagan, it began to go the other way, but it was the struggles that created the possibility of progressive education. When I was young, there was only one Marxist economist tenured in the United States, and now, although it's not fabulous, Marxist theory has a place in the university. But I'll give you an example with the COVID and pandemic and the murder of George Floyd, actually the police lynching of George Floyd, public lynching of George Floyd, we had massive protests in the United States, biggest since the Civil War, which really should say a lot. And what was unique about these protests is that they involved crossing the color line. The white population, and particularly white working class and white youth, particularly white youth, crossed the picket line and got behind a Black movement and a Black struggle. And this is unprecedented in US history. So, at least since the 17th century, practically, maybe it was absolutely unprecedented. And my department at the university had been talking about hiring an African American, male scholar. The African American males are considered a little bit more dangerous. Been talking about hiring an African American male for some 20 years, for quite a long time since, and we've only had one in such hire in our history. And finally, the faculty got behind the thing because of the George Floyd protests and united with the students to do such a hire, to do a special hire and get somebody. And so they happened to hire a Marxist, Black, eco-socialist, Julius McGee, one of the great, I think, going to be one of the great social scientists in the United States and the world as a result. I think that wouldn't have happened without the protests. If we want to change the education, the appropriation of education, we need more student protests, we need faculty protests, we need walkouts, we need teach-ins, and give them hell, and call the question on the hypocrisy. And what better issue than climate change? How many classes say anything about climate change, right? So there's a strategy. It's an age-old strategy. When I grew up, they called it the class struggle. That's what we need. Thanks.
Thank you so much, John. If everyone could give a quick virtual round of applause, please. I think there's a lot of love for the talk overall and the comments. I think people really appreciate what you had to say. Apologies that we don't have more time. What I'd like to do is urge you all, if you are in Scotland or the United Kingdom, to make your way to Glasgow for the protests. There is a list that Pete has posted up on the Contour website of all the upcoming actions that are available for you to participate in. So please do get involved with the struggle and with all the other struggles, including the trade union struggles that are happening in Glasgow right now. I hope you'll all agree that we should be supporting that as well. Thanks again to John, and thank you to the Havens Rights Centre for Social Justice at the University of Madison, Wisconsin. And thank you to Contour, the Scottish Marxist journal, which has taken on the Scottish establishment. So if you want to find out more about the upcoming lecture series, which include David Harvey, Kostas Lapavitsas, and many other brilliant speakers, please do visit their websites. Please do support independent media by visiting Contour and if you can help, helping out with a few quid a month. And otherwise, it's been an absolute delight to have you all here. I'm sure you've all really enjoyed the talk and the questions, and we'll see you again hopefully very soon. Thank you very much.